Um, yeah, so I made green what we already discussed. We have just one thing we need to do on this slide, and it's part of the yeah, when we say that we see a need for more conceptual framework theories to build upon in the project. So we discussed this taxonomy. We discussed frameworks to understand the mainstreaming, and then the third one is more that we see that there's also this decision-making context that yeah that requires theory, and you mentioned the dynamic adaptive policy pathways framework, which of course I support, and I think that part needs to be elaborated, and that's also what we mentioned yesterday, is that in this sustainable consumption, there's these multiple actors that are there, and which are also in your project in the work package 3, 4, and 5, and these stakeholders, they interact. That's kind of links to the niches mainstream, so the MLP framework, but yeah, I guess that needs to be addressed, like how are these actors linked, and that this decision making is also done over time. I had this one slide that could reflect this a little bit. So here you see like there's time and there's a sequence of decisions that, for example, the public takes, or the municipality in your case, or with the night trains. And then there's other actors that also take decisions over time. And part of this decision may be to go from niche to mainstream. But for example, here in this example, the decision of this actor could influence the decision of the other actor, either by by making things more mainstream, or by providing opportunities or facilitators linked to your framework, or drivers or whatever. But at least these different actors influence each other. And I think also in the example of the meet with the municipalities, like what the municipality does influences what the consumers do. So you could see this sequence of decisions as the green one could be the municipality and the blue one could be the consumers. Let's see. Oh yeah, that's what I wanted to say. Like here, this decision of this actor could influence the decision of the other actor, and then maybe some measures are not possible anymore, or maybe it makes it easier. So, yeah, lots of links. But I think in general you have the three actors, and there is this time element in the decision making also, because the purpose is to analyze from niche to mainstream. So there is this timing element of sequences of decisions, and the different actors, they can influence each other. This is just a thought, but something like that could be added and could be used. So these are just pathways, and this could be a way to extend the pathways framework and make it more applicable for this study.
No, I think this is very neat. When we were talking about this yesterday together, and then this diagram appeared. It's a neat illustration, I think, of what we're saying. But I think using this diagram and then using the immediately previous one, where we had the upscaling and we had the iterative kind of process, we were also thinking that this could be how you develop or you render this process, which is probably actually happening in your research project, you render it overt. So you also sort of research this process as it's happening in your projects. I think we'll come back. I haven't got the slide just in front of me. I think we'll come back to a point about this in a minute. Perhaps on our final slide it's there. But I think this is a picture of what is happening whilst you're running your project. And so we thought there might be ways of you rendering it explicit in terms of what's happening through your project as a result of you having an impact by running the project. So once you start asking people what they think about sustainability and what they're doing and everything else, you are going to actually be having an impact. It's not a neutral thing. You will be changing them. And because the whole drive of this research project is to make a change, it's not meant to be neutral. It's making a statement. We want to perhaps see many more sustainable consumption practices move from niche to mainstream. So you've got to position these. Then, if anything, you'll be influencing those stakeholders that you're working with in a direction. So there's some. So this isn't just something which you can say this is how we're going to measure what is happening, but it's actually also being created by your project.
Yeah. We move to the next one. I think the first one was already mentioned, the importance of having maybe a reduced number of papers, and then also decide on the possibilities for publication in terms of your investment in developing and writing that. And overall, I think in the break also mentioned that to someone talking about it, that and the project has so many activities, so many people involved, and will basically all our recommendations are to make some more coherence and not giving a very straight framework, but improve communication beyond the different work packages and to engage in some shared activities and shared language to make sure that there's coherence in the work. And one of the things that we came up with was having a shared common activity to promote that process of integration and the development of a game that was mentioned also for work package 6. Could be some way of integrating the different work packages and the different researchers involved in the project, and also the framing together. It was a suggestion that we had. For which game then?
We played a game on Wednesday. We discussed this already a bit. Like, could you build upon that? Like, have different features of that? But that I think that could be integrated also with making the framework. Like, what elements should be in the framework? Then you can also use that in this kind of. If you have this general idea of the framework, you can also apply this in this game, like setting. So I can imagine that there should be something on. The different consumption practices. These are different strategies that different actors, like you have the public, the municipal, the policy, and the private company. So maybe there should be different roles in this game. You had vision, so there's scenarios which are there, and that you could test how can we. Like, there could be a niche at the start of the game, and at the end you would like to have this mainstreamed, and what happens in between that you could kind of test. Any thoughts on that? No? Okay. Yeah, then we move to the next bullet is how do we factor time into the analysis? That was also mentioned yesterday. And we thought of three elements related to time. I think the first one came from you.
So this one about the visions changing. I think we did talk about it a bit yesterday, so we were just consolidating this in our conversation as the three of us. So, in order not to impose a top-down definition of sustainable consumption, you have worked with these four groups who've produced four visions of sustainable consumption. And we imagine that these visions will change even if you don't ever go and speak to those people ever again. Their visions will be changing. We talked, for example, we were just puzzling again about why water came up for north, a rural area north of Stockholm. But then we were hearing about the unusual, or maybe, I'm not quite sure if it's unusual or just fiercer or more frequent forest fires in Sweden last year. And certainly in the UK, we had unprecedented fires in heathlands that we're just not used to, and that have started again this year already. So these things are in our consciousness and are likely, but if it didn't happen, if we had 3 wet summers, then we'd forget about it, the average person. So we were thinking these visions will be changing, but we also thought it's the case that perhaps having even constructed a vision and contributed it into your research project, those people's ideas have changed a bit. And we talked a little bit yesterday, didn't we, about, well, what if we got those people who had those visions into the same room at the same time, or got some kind of connection, or had a discussion, these are the findings from the other study groups, what do you make of these? Does this change your idea of what sustainability is? You could actually build in change and influencing into the research design. And since you do have an interest in moving people from niche to mainstream and in getting people to have a more informed, perhaps, understanding of sustainability and a more understanding of the challenges and why it's necessary for us to adopt more sustainable consumption practices, that this would fit in with the ethos of the project as well. So we were also thinking that you could. So we started off thinking these are the 4 groups that you did your visioning work with, but then you've also got stakeholders, an impressive. We kept saying this, an impressive array of people who've bought into your project, who want to be alongside it, some of whom are here today, being alongside it in different ways, and they too will be developing over time, changing over time. New innovations will be coming up. There were 2 technical innovations that you mentioned yesterday. I'm going to remember something like Svana. One app. There was one app that was mentioned that measures stuff, I think, and then there was that other app which I really liked as a marketer, which enables you to make more informed choices, perhaps especially for holidays, but also for other activities. So you could almost imagine having the stakeholders in. And this could be an element in the game that you're all playing with. We're thinking of going on holiday to Scotland, or we're thinking of going on holiday to Vietnam. What would influence our thinking? How could we use this app? And so that some of the things that you've got in your research project, you could overtly introduce. It would engage stakeholders. It would be an activity to have with them. And then you would record it as something which is changing over time. So you wouldn't record it as absolute truth on this day, but you'd say this is part of the process of moving from niche to mainstream.
Okay, so indeed visions change, but practices also change. So you start with an inventory of say more sustainable practices in the different domains, but those practices, moving or not from niche to mainstream, change in the meantime. So we didn't have a solution for that, but take that into the only suggestion is to consider that. But what is what is mainstreaming actually? Is it the initial activity that you identified in the beginning as one of the 700? Is that still, if you are mainstream, if it's being mainstream, is it still the same activity? No, it is not. So that's obvious. So how do you fit into the time and the changes? That's a question. It's an open question to reflect on. But you cannot simply say, well, this is a good practice, a good activity, good practice, because it's scored on all the indicators. So if we mainstream that, then it's good also at the large mainstream level. Basically.
Yeah, I guess and then the third bullet is more on, again with time, is that the decisions are taken over time and that actors influence each other's decisions. So that's kind of the figure that we already discussed, and that these decisions also have a certain path dependency, either positive, like they enable follow-up actions, or they enable this becoming mainstream, or maybe they act as a barrier, and that may be more difficult. A mainstream, I guess, that's also should be part of the theoretical framework. I now realize it's not only going up, but it could also, go down again. Then I think we can go to the fourth, or do you want to add?
No. I would like to go to the fourth bullet point on the stakeholders, because as you already mentioned, you have a very impressive number of stakeholders involved, and in terms of number, but also in terms of an interesting composition, large multinational companies and small scale initiatives. So that's really a wonderful set of stakeholders involved. But the question, so we discussed a little bit more on, well, what does that involvement actually entail? Is their names is subscribed in the proposal at the beginning, and they will be informed about the findings at the end? Or is there more than that? Well, we saw a number of case studies being based on some of the stakeholder experiences. But we were thinking that it might be important and also interesting to see how they could be engaged more during the process. And I'm thinking about a project that we had. It's still going on, but that involved a number of different certification schemes, like FSC and MSC and Fair Trade and ISEAL. Well, a number of these organizations, and we involved them in the proposal development. But we also had actually biannual meetings with them, to report on partly to report on the findings, but also to engage with them on a particular activity. And it proved that they were very, very interested to actually attend these meetings. So the form varied, but so I think it would be very interesting also for you, considering the number of and the diversity of the stakeholders engaged in the project, and they are definitely interested, I think, all in either what kind of new developments they can expect in terms of sustainable consumption, or whether or not their strategy is promising for the future, which is basically for the small initiatives. So we suggest that you think about more active engagement with these stakeholder groups, to basically for three things. One is to disseminate not only the final findings, but maybe also some of the interesting findings along the way. So you can take out a particular case study or a particular issue that came up, and do that maybe once a year, I think. And then engage and then also see if there's any kind of interesting findings, research, or experiences from the stakeholder that relates to that issue. You could also, of course, use stakeholders to validate your findings and to see how broad they can be supported in. And thirdly, to engage them in the process. Because if you want to have data from your stakeholders, it's helpful if they are aware of where you are, what you're doing, and they feel part of the process, rather than you knock on the door and ask for figures, because, well, then they may be more hesitant. So, three elements: disseminate, validate, and engage in a more active process. That was a suggestion that we made.
Yes, I see we've written up what we were talking about as well. This is a good argument for the next 4 years. So, if you're thinking of having the project extended, and again, just to sort of picture this, if we go back, Caroline, to the one back again. Oops. There we go. So, if this is the process that you're undergoing with your stakeholders through the life of your project, you would again be enacting what you think is the niche to mainstream theoretical way of doing it. This you could be part of, finding out what fits, finding out what's responsible, feeding that back in, it going around the cycle a few times. And that is an argument for keeping the project going longer, because now you've made a real virtue out of having time and having engagement and recording change. So if you did want an extension, this would be a good way, I think, of arguing for it, that you're now involved in a process where you took information, people shared, you wrote some cases, but there's actually this iterative thing that's going on. Could develop even better given some more time. That was just our sort of positive support, really, for what you're doing.
To reflect on the stakeholder part, if there are any questions.
We didn't really discuss that part yesterday.
I think it's built not to break. I just have a comment or reflection on the stakeholder part, in terms of the potential challenges that might arise there, and I do that particularly from a business model perspective, as our primary stakeholders, one could say, are businesses, and the challenge that I think we are trying rather hard to identify research questions that are relevant for the stakeholders, and have among others had 3 workshops where we try to not only come with a theoretical approach and say this is what we're going to do, but rather here's some ideas, what are your ideas, can we find common ground. One risk there is, and that of course, so one risk is that their interests do not align with what they think is high priority, doesn't align with what we think is high priority, and obviously, I mean, that's for us to solve. In the end, that's a complication you have to deal with. The other complication I feel when it comes to businesses is that the more closely aligned you try to be with them, or the closer you work together with them, the higher I perceive the risk of buying into their agenda, or being sucked up by their agenda, which is, just as an example, if you would identify a sustainable consumption niche, that you say, all right, let's now try to find ways how to implement that in a business. Nobody says that the niche will still be sustainable once it's scaled up. And what is easiest to scale up for a business might also mean that it loses its sustainability credentials along the way. And I don't really have a question. I'm just these are the things that strike me as challenging. we have, I didn't get to mention that, but we are trying right now to get one IKEA employee to be embedded at the university for 20% for a year with us. And that's great in many ways and will, I think, very much feed into this suggestion that you had. But of course, the IKEA agenda is going to be strong there, which is most likely, I don't know what IKEA discusses internally, but I think making money is still pretty high on their agenda, even in 2 years' time or 3 years' time. And you said you've had success in working with stakeholders closely before. Was that an issue in that cooperation?
Um, no, not really. And I must add that most of them were NGOs, but there were also a couple of private companies involved. And well, you have to be clear, of course, but it also they are aware that you are a university or a research institute, so it's not like you call it applied research that they expect you to solve their problems. Basically, what I found interesting was that they were particularly interested in new developments, in innovative framing, so things that they haven't thought about themselves. So there was not an effort to align our research under their interest or their control. No, they were curious to see, because they are companies, but also NGOs, they are afraid they miss new opportunities, they miss new developments. So they saw us, if I may be charging a little bit, but they saw us as a kind of possibilities to see which new developments are coming up in terms. For our research was on sustainability certification, but also sustainable consumption. I'm convinced that companies, but also smaller initiatives are interested to see, well, where is it going? What is the direction? And if you can contribute to that kind of thinking, to inform them, but also give them examples, they will be interested. That's what I'm convinced of. And maybe at least it is worth a try to avoid that you have a final workshop presenting your findings, and then you say thank you for the collaboration, and then can we get your signature for a new proposal? I mean, there is an opportunity to engage them more actively. That's basically the point.
I mean, I think I'd add that, let's imagine that as a result of your intervention with IKEA, a few potentially really good sustainable consumption ideas die, and instead highly exploitative ideas thrive. Well, that's all right, isn't it? Because you found this out. It's part of your project. And then you think, well, I wonder why that happened. I wonder if we could have prevented it. I wonder if. So you've got... I'm not sure that it's going to work if you only have successes anyway. I mean, so many of the small food companies who do exciting alternative things get bought up by Nestle, don't they? And then you're really, from a branding point of view, they keep the original pure brand, but actually they're owned by this rather unpleasant large conglomerate. So we know how good ideas get co-opted by larger companies. Well, we know that they get co-opted. Perhaps we don't know how they get co-opted, when they get co-opted, why they get co-opted, and just have an inside track. At worst, if you had an inside track on an element of co-option, whereby they lured you in and used you for marketing purposes and actually developed something which was more destructive of natural resources, well, they wouldn't have the final word, would they? Because you could build that into your understanding of how to develop projects into the future and how to prevent it, and that this is actually a key hurdle to be overcome. So I'm quite optimistic in a sense, as long as the thing is done reflectively and done as a research project, that almost any sort of cooperation with stakeholders is of interest. it's just as likely, I think, that in a multi-stakeholder meeting, as Peter's telling us, and as I recall from our food consumption one, they might hear about how another company has been tempted into this terrible way of exploiting resources, but they instead did something else new and exciting. I think, well, actually, we could also make money. And I'll go and present the two options to my manager next time, not just the one. There's an alternative. We learned about it from a company that we met when we were part of this project a few weeks ago. So I think there are lots of unpredictable things, but I think as researchers we can make use of all of them.
Just to comment on this stakeholder involvement, I think our ambition here is at least to use or interact more closely, perhaps not with all, that can be difficult, but with some, and also, so not only in sort of dialogue or this, as you suggest, that's really important, but in terms of the engage, also have some, at least we have ideas on doing kind of more like experiments or tests with them. And I think that for us as researchers, I think that's very interesting, and we get to do research in ways that are difficult to do if we're in strictly academic context. And it's also interesting for them to get like real life experience of testing something for a short period or in a specific whatever location or something. Like Erik was talking about, for instance, designing or being kind of interventionist in designing a setup in terms of opt-in, opt-out, or I mean that kind of thinking in research. We'll see how far we get, but that's at least the intention. Perhaps we can do it more or we learn more how to design these things in a good way for phase 2.
I mean, just for example, this app which I'm so enthusiastic about, that you could tell whether you should go on a cruise or whether you should go on a hiking holiday in terms of the sustainable impact of your vacationing. Obviously, as a side thing, because you've got this serious business model project that you're doing with IKEA, but as a side, as part of their stakeholder involvement, if they came into a multi-stakeholder meeting and were playing with this app, then there might be a way of them giving, because I understand this app needs good data. I mean, it's got to actually have real data about the miles used and emissions produced, etc. But if you could have an app that would feed in the data from IKEA as to how sustainable their chairs are or their bookcases, and then they could end up with, as an end product, that you could have an app and decide, actually, if I go to IKEA to buy my chairs, they're going to be so much more, and I can prove it, they're much more sustainably than going down the road to an alternative chair provider or bookcase provider. That would be a marketable benefit to IKEA. So just for them, they might then participate and give the data in, which would help develop the app, but also help develop their story that they really are producing their products more sustainably.
Yeah, I can't prevent thinking about the example of the so-called vegetable butcher in the Netherlands. The vegetable butcher, he was producing and designing all kinds of meat replacement that looked like and taste as much like he can to the meat mainstream products. But that was really a niche innovation. And he became increasingly successful. So at a certain moment there was even protest from parliamentarians who opposed his naming of the items, because he played with the meat words used for those products. And then he became so successful that he was bought up by Unilever. And he was very happy that he was bought up by Unilever, because now the products could be available and produced in much wider areas of Europe. So that would be an excellent example of mainstreaming, or not. I mean, that's an interesting question. So engaging with these larger companies is also one of the key questions you have to deal with if you talk about mainstreaming. you can't imagine. He was not able to produce on a large scale meat replacement based on more sustainably provided inputs. So you can there can be a lot of discussion on that, but I think engaging with stakeholders brings you up with these kind of discussions as well. So these small scale initiatives, can they mainstream on their own, or do they need to engage with larger actors? And how can you do that? So sorry, it's a sideline, but it's a very nice example of mainstream.
Any more comments? Yeah.
Yes, I'd like to comment on this, the actor pathways or stakeholder pathways. That I think would be very interesting to explore further and use in our context because it's complex. And then, when you also talked about then, and I also think a lot about change and dynamics and how everything changes and uncertainty and so on. And I was thinking when you talked about that our practices are changing, our actors are changing, and we are changing our actors and they are changing us. I was thinking maybe we should then also map their current plans that our partners have. I don't know if it's possible. I was thinking maybe we should look at their current plans and then incorporate that into the gaming and pathway work in work with 6. What do you think would be useful?
I would say yes, because that could be a very interesting input in your gaming when you, at certain moments in time, because your project is going for a number of years, you can have that kind of data as an input in your gaming, because these strategies for companies they change every couple of years. So and there are different reasons, arguments for doing that. So if you can map those, I think that would be very interesting input for your gaming, to have a more real life base on your process.
Yeah, we've done something similar with the game that we have where the sociologists in our study, they mapped how people changed the participants of the game changed their thinking from the beginning and then towards, and then I think 2 steps in between towards the end. And then they also had interviews at the before and after. Well, that's for the game, but you can also do that for the project, before and intermediate and maybe after that.
Also, it can be very to start off with Factor 6 also earlier on than. And I also think that that I had thought that we would do this kind of gaming in Work Package 6 and with our own stakeholders, our own societal partners in these kind of workshops that to discuss what they to be more active in this process, but also maybe other actors outside of this, maybe politicians. So I think, I agree with what you're saying about engaging them more. We will try to do that. Or something else. Oh, not right now.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think that, you might want to wait in terms of the engagement with politicians, etc., until you, had the more complete findings. So, whereas perhaps you were planning on doing that at the end, then this game can be developed with your stakeholders. Mistakes can be made, or better innovations can be replacing less good ones, and so that you refine the process and have a game that's really been tested out and practiced. Then you tell the politicians we have developed this. It's taken a number of years. We've gone through a number of iterations, and now we invite you. I think that's a stronger message and a more likely productive use of the game than to risk sort of practicing with them in the end, and wouldn't get such useful. Potentially, you might find some conflict or something, and wish you'd done it differently. But this time, you might still do that. You always can think of improving things, but you knew it would have gone through a number of stages.
Yeah, sounds like a good strategy.
Okay, I think we can go to the last bullet, which is not necessarily a final comment or important one, but there's just another thought that we had is that the visions that were presented and the consumption practices could maybe could be linked. So, for example, which practices could lead to some of these visions, and which not. So you could have like this utopia or dystopia matches. It could be a matrix, but you could also incorporate time in there. Like, are there any crucial decisions or crucial consumption practices that may lead to some of these visions, or that may put you on a different path? And then also link it to the stakeholders. Like, some of these consumption practices are particularly done by the policymakers or the private companies, or maybe the public. And then you can later use that. That could be like a static assessment first, and then later add time to that. So then you move towards your pathway. Then you have like a link from work package, I think 1 and 2 towards 6.
No, I don't want that. I think that was what we came up yesterday. So I hope these are helpful comments. And if you have any other questions or comments, welcome.
Any comments?
Just one comment on that. The last point that I think work package 1 and work package 6 should maybe have more interaction and talk about this, how we link them to practices to the rest together. That sounds like actually this vision work was in work package 6, but now I moved it to work package 1 to get more of a time.
We have some final reflections.
Yeah.
If there are other.
Yes, take your chance now to talk.
Thank you for very interesting comments. I'm Jan Berta from the Swedish Consumers Association, one of the stakeholders, and I'm also a member of the board of the external project. And I think you had very interesting comments here, and I especially like what you say, number 3 and 4 here, about stakeholder involvement. I think it's very important that you find effective ways to have a dialogue. Scientists and civil society. We are very much speaking about stakeholders as business partners and business and having business models, which is very important, but it's very important also that you, which you do very much in a very good way, I think, in this project. Have a platform in the consumer perspective. You see what's really working, talking about drivers and obstacles. And this is just a comment from the sidelines, so to speak, to explore how you can engage and have a dialogue with the civil society, because there the knowledge about the obstacles, the real obstacles for especially vulnerable groups of consumers, and this is really a huge challenge, how to get the sustainable choice, both easy and affordable. So there is a potential here. I think that's since this project is so practical oriented, and that's what I really like about this, what you're doing, and I think it's important as a common fourth body policy to do even more and think about ways how we can be more effective.
Any other?
I can just add that I'm also part of the European consumer movement. I'm in the board and responsible for the sustainable development. How within the consumer movement, there's 40 organizations all over Europe, and we discussed just the other day how we're going to discuss the issue of meat consumption. It's a very tricky one because it's very different from one end of the EU to the other, and it's very much about integrity or private issues, and it's also very delicate sometimes when we discuss these matters, because consumer movement traditionally very much thought that the price issue is the number one. It must be everything must be very cheap. So they're thinking we are thinking very much in short term, and now it's time to think in the long term.
Any more comments? Questions? On the feedback? You have too much to think about now. Yeah? Okay. So should we take your final...
Yeah. You start, Åsa, and then I am.
You want to stay there? Yeah.
We stay here.
Yes. So it has been really useful for us to have you here and to have provided us with a lot of good feedback and a lot to think about. Luckily, we have this two-day workshop in August, so we will have time to discuss. But it will only be the resources, not side partners. So that will have to take in another step later. But I think we have a lot of things to discuss now. And so some points that we I think that we have picked up that we need to talk about is that we are very different. We are from different disciplines and we have different words for things. And we have discussed now. One thing that we have discussed is whether we need a common theoretical groundwork framework for transitions, and what is that then? We can then base it on our ideas and have this discussion in August to see, okay, even if we may not agree on everything, maybe we can have some kind of common thing that is to relate to, and maybe we say, well, we don't do that, but we, anyway, it will be something to think that's a really good point. And I think we also need to talk about that we have different methods and theories, and we need to understand what we mean when we talk about things, because we don't understand each other now, as you have pointed out. And we don't have to agree, but discuss what we agree on and what we don't agree on. Another thing was that what we said about time and how to incorporate time and change and timelines, and also yesterday that we discussed different phases of life. That we should also try to incorporate more. Personally, I think this is very important, but also difficult to understand how. So we need to help each other how to do this in practice. Also we'll try to take the stakeholder groups that discuss it. We'll try to approach them in a different part, more product, more steps in the process. I would appreciate on. And something else I was supposed to
Are you?
Yes, we're very grateful for you coming here and giving us feedback in a way that is really useful, not to get it at the end of the project, but here when we have been working with this project for a little more than a year. Just a few things, I think, to repeat this, I think this idea of doing a common glossary is something we could really do. It doesn't have to be super ambitious. It's something we could start with, and then, once we read more stuff and discuss, we could add to this document. I think that is a good idea. And also something you brought up yesterday with somehow not losing the consumer or end user perspective. I think we have had that very much in our sort of inventorying and in our gathering of different visions at the beginning, but there's perhaps a risk of once we come into more policy and steering that we forget about asking or being in close contact with consumers. So I think that's an important aspect. And also what you raised today about mainstreaming, I think that's really interesting, and what is actually, the difference between mainstreaming in a, say, positive sense or co-optation, which is often used in different ways. So I think that's definitely something to consider, and maybe we don't, probably in this group and also in relation to our partners, we'll have different ideas about this. For sure. So I think that's a good point to reflect upon. So the idea with you as a group is that you will connect with us again, perhaps in between also, but at least next year we plan to have some kind of touch point with you again, and not physically a meeting like this, but digitally or virtually in some way, so you don't need to travel so much. That's the idea. And then also in the coming year, 2021, then hopefully we can gather with you and also the two other persons, Gil Seifang and Arnold Tischer. So that's the plan, basically. And I should just say, Linda is here. 1 second. Linda, kom en gång. So now, you know the program, maybe we end a little bit before 12.
Yeah.
But then we start a little bit earlier because we have a rather packed schedule with your mini lectures. So that's the plan. But I would just like to say a big thank you to Linda Wikström. She arranged all the practicalities for this meeting, which is really important to be able to have such good discussions. We need everything to work, so good job, Linda. Yeah. And also Marta has been arranging with all the filmmaking and stuff like that, so that's also very important. So we don't have any presents here, but a big thank you to you and to you. Yeah.